Picture this. It's April 30th, 1943. A body washes ashore on the coast of Spain. The man is wearing a British Royal Marines uniform. Chained to his wrist is a briefcase containing top-secret documents about the Allied invasion plans for World War II. But here's the twist that sounds too crazy to be true. This man was never alive, at least not when this mission began. In those documents, completely fake. Yet, this elaborate deception would go on to fool Adolf Hitler himself, change the course of World War II, and save thousands of Allied lives. Welcome to the story of Operation Mincemeat, arguably the most bizarre, audacious, and successful military deception in human history. I'm going to take you through every incredible detail of this operation: how British intelligence found the perfect corpse, how they created an entire fake identity complete with love letters and theater ticket stubs, how they convinced the Spanish, and through them the Nazis, that this body was real, and how this single dead man became one of the most important weapons in the Allied arsenal. This isn't just a story about deception. It's about the desperate measures nations take during wartime, the incredible creativity of intelligence officers pushed to their limits, and the thin line between genius and insanity that often defines military strategy. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear is completely true, even though every part of it sounds absolutely impossible. To understand why the British would do something so seemingly insane, we need to rewind a few months to early 1943. The war in Europe had been raging for nearly 4 years. The Allies had achieved some crucial victories, particularly in North Africa, where Field Marshal Montgomery had defeated Rommel's forces. But everyone knew the real fight was still ahead. To defeat Nazi Germany, the Allies needed to invade Europe. The question wasn't if, it was where and when. The strategic situation was this. The Allies controlled North Africa. The obvious next step was to cross the Mediterranean and attack what Winston Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe, meaning Italy. And if you look at a map, the most logical place to launch that invasion was Sicily. Sicily made perfect sense. It was the stepping stone to mainland Italy. It was within range of Allied air cover from North Africa. Capture Sicily, and you could strangle Axis supply routes, knock Italy out of the war, and open up a second front in Europe. There was just one massive problem. It was too obvious. The Germans knew it. Hitler knew it. Every military strategist worth their salt knew that Sicily was the logical target. German intelligence had already predicted it. Hitler had ordered significant reinforcements to Sicily and surrounding areas. If the Allies invaded there, they would be walking into a heavily fortified death trap. The Allied commanders faced a nightmare scenario. They had to invade Sicily. The strategic logic was inescapable. But they also knew the Germans were expecting them. Military intelligence estimated that a direct assault on a well-defended Sicily could cost tens of thousands of Allied lives, maybe more. This is where the British intelligence services enter the picture. British intelligence, particularly MI5 and a special deception unit called the London Controlling Section, had been running various deception operations throughout the war. They'd had some successes convincing the Germans to move troops to the wrong locations or to expect attacks that never came, but nothing on the scale of what they were now contemplating. The challenge was enormous. How do you convince the enemy that you're not going to invade the most obvious target? How do you make them believe you're going somewhere else when all strategic logic points to Sicily? The man who would answer that question was named Ewan Montagu. He was a British naval intelligence officer, a lawyer by training, and a key member of the intelligence deception team. Montagu and his colleagues had been brainstorming wild ideas for months. They considered dozens of scenarios. Could they plant fake radio traffic, stage elaborate exercises that suggested a different target, use double agents to spread false information? All of these had problems. They were either too obvious, too complex, or too easy for German intelligence to see through. Then, someone remembered an old idea that had been floating around intelligence circles. It came from a memo written before the war by Rear Admiral John Godfrey and his assistant, a young naval intelligence officer named Ian Fleming. Yes, that Ian Fleming, who would later create James Bond. The idea was simple in concept, but insane in execution. What if you planted fake invasion plans on a dead body, made it look like an accident, and let the body wash up where enemy intelligence would find it? When Montagu first heard this idea, even he thought it was crazy. It required so many things to go right. They'd need a body, they'd need a believable identity, they'd need documents that looked authentic, they'd need to get the body to the right place at the right time, they'd need the Spanish to find it, to report it to the Germans, and for the Germans to believe it was all real. The chances of success seemed impossibly small. But the alternative, sending Allied soldiers into a heavily defended Sicily, was even worse. In January 1943, the decision was made. They would attempt the impossible. They would create a fake person, give him fake documents, and try to fool the greatest military machine in the world. They gave it a code name that reflected the dark nature of the plan, Operation Mincemeat. And now they needed a corpse.
Finding a suitable body was harder than you might think. The corpse needed to meet very specific criteria. It had to be a male of military age. The body had to be in good enough condition that it would look like a recent drowning victim, not someone who had been dead for weeks. And critically, they needed to find someone whose death could be explained as drowning at sea, even though that person had actually died of something else. This wasn't just about finding anybody. It was about finding a body that could pass a potential autopsy by German doctors. The team approached Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the most famous forensic pathologist in Britain. They explained what they needed, carefully because the entire operation was top secret. Spilsbury considered the problem. He explained that drowning is actually very difficult to confirm definitively during an autopsy, especially after a body has been in the water for several days. But he warned them, the body couldn't show signs of the wrong kind of death. No bullet holes, no obvious trauma, no signs of disease that would be inconsistent with an active military officer. After months of careful, discreet searching, they found their man. The body was that of Glyndwr Michael, a 34-year-old Welsh homeless man who had died in January 1943 from accidentally ingesting rat poison containing phosphorus. For decades, this identity was kept secret, and the body was simply known by the fake identity they would give it. Michael's death was tragic, but his body would serve a purpose he could never have imagined. Critically, phosphorus poisoning could be mistaken for the effects of drowning and hypothermia. If German doctors performed an autopsy, they would find fluid in the lungs and other signs consistent with death by drowning. Now came the truly elaborate part, creating an identity. They named him Captain William Martin of the Royal Marines. But giving him a name wasn't nearly enough. German intelligence officers were smart. They would check every detail. So Montagu and his team set about creating an entire human life. They gave Captain Martin a backstory. He was engaged to be married to a woman named Pam. They created love letters, passionate, personal, intimate letters that would make anyone reading them believe this was a real couple. One letter from Pam read, "I do think, dearest, that Mummy is being rather difficult, though I know she doesn't mean to be. She's so old-fashioned and narrow-minded about so many things." These weren't just generic love letters. They were filled with inside jokes, references to shared experiences, arguments and makeups, the messy reality of a real relationship. They gave Martin theater ticket stubs from recent London shows, a receipt for an engagement ring purchased at a fancy jeweler, keys to a London flat, a stern letter from his bank about his overdraft, because what makes someone real is their financial struggles. They even included a replacement ID card, suggesting he'd lost the original, another humanizing detail. In his wallet, they placed photographs. One was of Pam, actually a female MI5 clerk, who had agreed to pose for the photo. They dressed her in period-appropriate clothing and had her write affectionate messages on the back of the photos. They included business correspondence, including a letter from Martin's father discussing mundane family matters and gently chiding his son about money management. Every single detail was designed to build up layers of authenticity, because the team knew that German intelligence wouldn't just glance at these documents. They would scrutinize them, investigate them, try to poke holes in the story. But all of this personal material was just the packaging. The real payload was the military intelligence. They created documents that appeared to show the Allied invasion plans not for Sicily, but for Greece and Sardinia. These documents took the form of personal letters between high-ranking British officers discussing invasion plans, in the kind of casual, confident language that suggested they believed the information was secure. One letter was supposedly from Lieutenant General Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Harold Alexander, Commander of Allied forces in North Africa. It referenced Sicily only as a cover story, a feint designed to draw German attention away from the real targets of Greece and Sardinia. The genius of these documents was their subtlety. They didn't scream, "secret invasion plans." Instead, they were written as personal correspondence between colleagues, with references to the invasion plans buried in casual language, the way real officers might write to each other. They even included humor and personal touches in these military letters, references to sardines playing on the word Sardinia, and other small jokes that made them feel authentic rather than fabricated. The team spent weeks getting every detail right. They aged the documents slightly, making them look like they'd been carried around for a few days. They used typewriters and paper stock that were standard issue for British military offices. They practiced the signatures of the senior officers until they were perfect. Finally, they were ready. They dressed the body in full Royal Marines uniform. They attached the briefcase to his wrist with a chain, the standard way sensitive documents were transported by military couriers. Then, they placed all the personal effects in his pockets. And then they faced the next enormous challenge, getting this body to Spain.
At 6 p.m. on April 19, 1943, a British submarine called HMS Seraph departed from a Scottish port on one of the strangest missions in naval history. Aboard was Ewen Montague and another intelligence officer, along with a canister marked "Optical Instruments, handled with care." Inside that canister, packed in dry ice, was the body of Captain William Martin. The submarine's crew hadn't been told the full details of the mission. The captain, Lieutenant Bill Jewell, knew only that he was transporting something critically important for the war effort, and that absolute secrecy was essential. As the submarine made its way toward the Spanish coast, Montague and his colleague did something that seems almost unbearably strange. They spent time with the body. They checked and rechecked every detail of Martin's uniform and documents. They made sure everything was perfect. Think about how surreal this must have been. These intelligence officers, in the cramped confines of a submarine, preparing a dead man for his final mission. The success of the upcoming invasion and the lives of thousands of Allied soldiers depended on getting every detail right. The target location had been chosen very carefully, the Spanish coast near Huelva, a town in southwestern Spain. Why Spain? Spain was officially neutral in World War II, but it was a complex kind of neutrality. The Spanish government under Francisco Franco had fascist sympathies and maintained close relationships with Nazi Germany. Most importantly, the Germans had a very active intelligence network operating in Spain. The plan was this. The body would be released off the coast of Huelva, where currents would carry it ashore. Local Spanish authorities would find it, along with the briefcase. Being good bureaucrats, they would report the discovery to Spanish intelligence. And Spanish intelligence, with its close ties to Germany, would inevitably share the documents with the Nazis. But there were so many things that could go wrong. What if the currents didn't carry the body to shore and it just sank or floated out to sea? What if the briefcase came loose? What if Spanish authorities found the body but didn't bother examining the documents carefully? What if they immediately turned everything over to the British before the Germans could see it? What if German intelligence was suspicious of such a convenient discovery? On the night of April 30th, HMS Seraph reached the designated position about a mile off the Spanish coast, near the mouth of the Huelva River. Lieutenant Jewell brought the submarine to the surface. It was around 4:30 a.m., still dark with dawn approaching. This timing was crucial. The body needed to be in the water long enough to look like it had been there for a while, but not so long that it would decompose beyond recognition. The canister was brought up to the deck. Montague and his colleague opened it and carefully removed the body. In the darkness, lit only by carefully shielded flashlights, they performed their final checks. They inflated Martin's life jacket, a critical detail. A courier carrying secret documents wouldn't be floating at sea without a life jacket. The inflated jacket would help keep the body buoyant and ensure it would wash ashore rather than sink. At 4:30 a.m. precisely, they slid the body of Captain William Martin into the cold waters of the Atlantic. As the submarine crew watched, the body began to drift away from the submarine, carried by the current toward the Spanish coast. The briefcase was still chained securely to the wrist. Before leaving the area, Montague and his colleague did something that seems almost ceremonial. They stood on the deck and recited a prayer for the dead. This man, Glyndwr Michael, had died homeless and alone. Now he was being given a purpose, a mission, an identity. Then HMS Seraph dove beneath the surface and began the long journey back to Britain. All they could do now was wait. Back in London, Montague sent a coded message to British intelligence officers. Mincemeat completed. The next part of the operation was entirely out of British hands. They could only hope that the Spanish would find the body, that the Germans would take the bait, and that the elaborate deception would work. For the next 2 weeks, Montague and his team waited anxiously for any news from Spain. Had the body washed ashore? Had anyone found it? Had the documents been discovered? These questions kept the intelligence team awake at night. Then finally, the news started trickling in. On May 2nd, just 2 days after the body had been released into the water, a Spanish fisherman had found something floating near the shore. It was a body of a British Royal Marine officer. The Spanish authorities were contacted. The local Spanish officials examined the body and the briefcase still chained to its wrist. Being proper bureaucrats, they confiscated everything and began the process of notifying British authorities, as international protocol required when the body of a foreign military officer was found. But before they notified the British, they did exactly what Montague's team had hoped. They photographed the documents, and those photographs were passed to Spanish intelligence. And Spanish intelligence, with its close ties to Berlin, passed them directly to German intelligence. The bait had been taken, but would the Germans believe it? In Berlin, German intelligence officers studied the documents recovered from Captain Martin's body with intense scrutiny. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, was led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. They were not amateurs. These were experienced intelligence professionals who had spent years analyzing Allied deceptions and propaganda. They would not be easily fooled. The Germans examined every aspect of the find. They checked Martin's identity. They analyzed the paper the documents were written on. They studied the signatures. They tried to verify the letterheads. They looked for any sign that this might be a plant, a deception. British intelligence officers back in London waited anxiously. They knew the Germans would investigate thoroughly. The question was, would their meticulous preparation be enough? Days turned into weeks, still no indication of what the Germans were thinking. Then, the British got their first hint that the operation might be working. They were reading German communications, not all of them, but enough to pick up certain patterns. The Enigma code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park began intercepting German military messages that mentioned reinforcing Greece and Sardinia. More signals came in.
German naval units in the Mediterranean were being repositioned. Coastal defenses in Greece were being strengthened. Most telling of all, German troop movements suggested they were preparing for an invasion of the Balkans, not Sicily. But the real confirmation came when intercepted communications revealed something extraordinary. The documents had made their way all the way to Adolf Hitler himself. Hitler held a high-level military conference on May 12, 1943. He reviewed the intelligence about Allied invasion plans, and he made a fateful decision. He believed the documents were genuine. Hitler was particularly convinced that the Allies would invade Greece. This made sense to him for several reasons. Greece had strategic value. It was within range of Romanian oil fields that Germany desperately needed. An Allied attack through the Balkans could threaten the entire German southern front. Hitler ordered significant German forces moved away from Sicily. An entire panzer division, the 1st Panzer Division, was moved from France to Greece. Coastal defenses in Sicily were actually reduced. German minesweepers were sent to the Greek coast. Luftwaffe squadrons were repositioned to defend Greece and Sardinia. The Germans were so convinced that they even began preparing diplomatic overtures to Turkey, fearing that the Allies might try to bring Turkey into the war as part of a Balkan invasion strategy. Intercepted communications showed that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, one of Germany's most brilliant tactical commanders, personally believed the intelligence. German High Command circulated the information to various military units, treating it as credible intelligence. One intercepted message was particularly telling. It came from German Naval Command and essentially said that the discovered documents provided clear insight into Allied invasion plans, and that units should prepare accordingly for attacks on Greece and Sardinia, while Sicily was likely just a diversion. Back in London, Montagu and his team could barely believe their success. The Germans had not only fallen for the deception, they had fallen for it completely. Winston Churchill was briefed on the operation's success. The Prime Minister, who loved the dramatic and the clever in equal measure, was reportedly delighted. But there was still one final test ahead: the actual invasion of Sicily. If the Germans had truly been deceived, the invasion would face lighter resistance than expected. If they were laying a trap, if they had somehow seen through the deception and were preparing to ambush the Allied forces, then Operation Mincemeat would have sent thousands of soldiers to their deaths. As June 1943 turned to July and the date of the invasion approached, the tension in Allied command was almost unbearable. Everything depended on a dead man's credibility.
July 10, 1943. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, began. Over 160,000 Allied troops launched the largest amphibious invasion in history up to that point. It would be exceeded only by the D-Day landings in Normandy a year later. As Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Sicily, commanders held their breath. If Operation Mincemeat had failed, if the Germans had seen through the deception, they would be landing in a death trap. But as the invasion progressed, something remarkable became clear. The beaches were far more lightly defended than intelligence had predicted. German forces in Sicily had been reduced. The 1st Panzer Division that should have been defending the island was in Greece. Coastal artillery that could have devastated the landing forces had been moved to Sardinia. Luftwaffe air cover was thin because fighter squadrons had been repositioned to protect the Balkans. The Germans fought hard. They were still formidable opponents, but they were not prepared for an invasion of this scale in this location. They had been looking the wrong way. The invasion of Sicily succeeded beyond Allied expectations. Within 38 days, the entire island was captured. Allied casualties were significant, but far lower than the worst-case scenarios that had been predicted before Operation Mincemeat.
Military historians estimate that Operation Mincemeat may have saved tens of thousands of Allied lives by reducing German defensive preparations in Sicily. The capture of Sicily had enormous strategic consequences. It knocked Italy out of the war. Mussolini's government collapsed. Italy would soon switch sides and join the Allies. The entire Mediterranean became an Allied-controlled waterway, and it opened the path for the eventual invasion of mainland Europe. All because a homeless Welshman's body had been turned into a secret weapon. But the story doesn't end there. After the invasion, British intelligence had to be careful to maintain the deception. They couldn't let the Germans know they'd been fooled, not yet. That information might compromise future deception operations. So they arranged for Captain William Martin to be buried with full military honors in Spain. A gravestone was erected in Huelva that read, "William Martin, born 29th March 1907, died 24th April 1943, beloved son of John Glyndwr Martin and the late Antonia Martin of Cardiff, Wales. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country." That grave is still there today, visited by military historians and tourists who know the extraordinary story behind it. The Germans apparently never realized they had been deceived. Even after the war, when German officers were interviewed, many still believed the documents had been genuine and that the Allies had simply changed their plans at the last minute. The true story of Operation Mincemeat remained classified for years. Ewan Montague finally revealed the details in a 1953 book called The Man Who Never Was. It became a bestseller and was later adapted into a film. For decades, the true identity of the body was kept secret, known only as the Man Who Never Was. Only in the 1990s was it finally revealed that the body was Glyndwr Michael, and a proper memorial was erected to honor his contribution to the war effort. The operation's success had lasting impacts on military intelligence. It proved that elaborate deceptions could work even against sophisticated opponents. Many of the techniques pioneered in Operation Mincemeat will be refined and used again for D-Day, where Operation Fortitude convinced the Germans that the invasion of Normandy was a feint, and the real attack would come at Calais. Ian Fleming, whose original memo had inspired the idea, would go on to create the James Bond novels, filling them with the kind of elaborate, audacious intelligence operations he had witnessed during the war. Ian Montague continued his intelligence work and later became a judge. He was always careful about discussing the operation, respecting the classified nature of intelligence work even decades later. Operation Mincemeat represents something profound about warfare and human ingenuity. Faced with an impossible problem, invading an island that the enemy knew you had to invade, these intelligence officers created a solution so audacious that it sounds like fiction. They understood something fundamental, that the most powerful weapon in war isn't always the biggest gun or the most soldiers. Sometimes it's the ability to make your enemy look the wrong direction at the crucial moment. They took one of humanity's oldest taboos, the use of the dead, and turned it into a tool that saved the living. The question of ethics remains complex. Was it right to use Glyndwr Michael's body this way? He never consented. He died alone and forgotten. But his body played a role in shortening the war and saving lives. Montague himself wrestled with this question. In his later writings, he expressed both pride in the operation's success and a certain discomfort with its methods. He argued that the ends justified the means, but he never seemed entirely comfortable with that argument. What's undeniable is that Operation Mincemeat worked. A dead man convinced Hitler. A corpse changed the course of history, and thousands of Allied soldiers who might have died on the beaches of Sicily lived to see the end of the war. In Huelva, Spain, that grave still stands. Tourists visit it, often leaving flowers. The inscription remains William Martin, a name that belonged to no one and everyone, a fiction that became more real than reality itself. Because in war, as in espionage, sometimes the most powerful truths are built on lies. And sometimes the dead can change the world. Operation Mincemeat reminds us that history's turning points don't always happen in dramatic battles or grand moments. Sometimes they happen quietly, in the planning rooms where desperate people make impossible plans. Sometimes they happen when a body washes ashore on a Spanish beach, carrying secrets that aren't secrets at all, but carefully constructed lies designed to save lives by taking advantage of a truth that even the most suspicious minds want to believe in a lucky break. The next time you hear about World War II, remember this story. Remember that behind every invasion, every battle, every victory, there were often invisible operations that made the difference. Remember the intelligence officers who spent months creating a person who never existed. Remember the submarine crew who carried a corpse across the Atlantic. Remember Glyndor Michael, who died homeless and alone, but became, in death, a hero who changed history. And remember that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the true ones. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most incredible operations, please like this video and subscribe for more fascinating stories from history. Let me know in the comments. Had you heard of Operation Mincemeat before? What other World War II intelligence operations would you like me to cover? Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, history is always stranger than fiction.